All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're going to unpack the massive, sweeping historical forces, empire, expansion, conflict that literally built the modern world. We'll be looking at the fascinating and honestly often sobering journey of how nations grow, from the earliest indigenous settlements in North America all the way to the incredibly complex geopolitical rivalries of the 20th century. To make sense of thousands of years of history, here is our roadmap. We'll start with First Peoples and colonization, move on to expansion and stolen lands, look at division, industry, and depression, track the march to global war, and wrap up with the era of superpowers. So let's kick things off with part one, First Peoples and colonization. If we zoom way back to about 30,000 years ago, we see Paleo-American migration via Beringia. Fast forward to the year 1100, and you've got the Mississippian city of Cahokia. It's thriving, sustaining around 20,000 people. To put that into perspective, that made it bigger than London at the time. But as we know, this rich, complex indigenous history was abruptly and forever altered when European colonizers arrived, starting with Columbus in the Caribbean in 1492 and the English setting up Jamestown in 1607. You see, early colonization wasn't just people looking for a new home. It was a frantic, overlapping scramble for land and power. You had Spanish expeditions pushing up into Florida and Mexico, while French claims were stretching way down the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, the English barely survived in Jamestown, really only scraping by thanks to a highly lucrative new crop, tobacco. And that relentless pursuit of profit laid a truly horrific foundation. By 1619, the first enslaved Africans were brought over to work those massive colonial cash crops, starting a brutal system of slavery that would haunt the continent for centuries. That brings us to part two, expansion and stolen lands. Now, check out this number. $15 million. In 1803, the newly formed United States dropped this staggering amount on the Louisiana Purchase. But here's the catch. They weren't actually buying the land from France because France didn't even own it. They were literally just buying the imperial rights to colonize it, basically paying France to step aside so the U.S. could deal with the native tribes who actually lived there. At first, the young nation tucked a really good game. George Washington himself claimed that dealing with native tribes would be directed entirely by, quote, the great principles of justice and humanity. The idea was to negotiate formal treaties, supposedly trying to distance themselves from the ruthless conquest methods of the old European empires they'd just fought a revolution against. Well, those high-minded ideals evaporated pretty quickly. As the settler population exploded and a booming cotton empire demanded more and more land in the Deep South, the U.S. government just started playing dirty. We're talking fabricating treaties, using unauthorized native leaders, and, incredibly, President Andrew Jackson completely ignoring a Supreme Court ruling that actually protected the Cherokee Nation. All of this ruthless maneuvering paved the exact way for the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And the human cost of that act? Absolutely devastating. 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly expelled from their ancestral lands. During what we now call the Trail of Tears, they were marched over 1,000 miles. It was a methodical, state-sponsored ethnic cleansing. In fact, it was so brutally calculated that Adolf Hitler would literally reference it a century later when planning his own expansions in Europe. Moving on to part three, division, industry, and depression. As the country expanded its borders all the way to the Pacific, it was tearing itself apart from the inside. You basically had two completely incompatible systems colliding. On one side, an industrializing North advocating for free states and wage labor. On the other side, an agricultural South absolutely dependent on a massive cotton kingdom, one that was fueled by millions of enslaved African Americans. Every single time a new Western territory was added, it sparked a toxic, fiery debate over whether slavery would be permitted there, pushing the young republic toward a vicious breaking point. That breaking point hit in 1861 with the outbreak of the American Civil War. By 1865, slavery was abolished, but at the horrific cost of over 600,000 lives. From those ashes, the nation sprinted into an era of explosive, somewhat lawless industrialization. The first transcontinental railroad was finished by 1869. But this rapid economic growth was built on an incredibly fragile foundation of speculation, which all came violently crashing down in 1929, plunging the U.S. and the entire world into the Great Depression. Which sets the stage for part four, the march to global war. To really understand this era, you have to grasp this number, 6.6 billion pounds. That was the massive, completely unpayable sum in reparations slapped on a defeated Germany at the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. It totally crippled their post-war economy and triggered hyperinflation that just wiped out ordinary citizens' life savings. And you know what happens when people are that desperate? It creates the perfect breeding ground for extremist politicians like Adolf Hitler, who swept in promising a return to national strength. Now, the world had been promised that this kind of international chaos was over. The League of Nations was set up with a clear mandate. Disputes would be resolved not by fighting, but by debate. It was a beautiful idea, specifically designed to stop international aggression in its tracks and protect human life from another global bloodbath. But step by step, we see that beautiful idea completely fall apart. In 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, and the League does nothing. In 1935, Mussolini's Italy conquers Abyssinia. The League does nothing. By 1936, Germany and Italy are openly using the Spanish Civil War as a testing ground for their militaries. And by 1938, Hitler is annexing Austria and the Sudetenland entirely unopposed. It was total impotence on the world stage. What you have here is a stark psychological contrast. On one hand, you've got traumatized democracies like Britain and France. They're economically weak from the Depression and so absolutely desperate to avoid another war that they are entirely on the defensive. On the other hand, the fascist powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, are hyper-militaristic, aggressively hunting for resources and actively testing out modern weaponry. That massive disconnect allowed these unpunished land grabs to continuously accelerate. And behind all the diplomatic posturing in Geneva, the reality on the ground was terrifying. The civilian cost was unimaginable. You had Japan massacring 300,000 civilians in Nanking, Italy dropping outlawed gas bombs on Abyssinia, Germany obliterating the entire town of Guernica with modern bombers. It was unchecked brutality, and everyday people paid the ultimate price for these empire-building campaigns. Finally, we arrive at Part 5, the era of superpowers. The shock of Pearl Harbor in 1941 dragged the U.S. out of its isolationism and transformed its economy into an unparalleled industrial war machine. The war ended in 1945 with the devastating deployment of atomic bombs, and by 1948, the U.S. was literally rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan. Through this rapid progression, the balance of global power completely shifted, firmly cementing the United States as a dominant superpower. But victory in World War II immediately gave way to the Cold War. This was a tense, decades-long geopolitical rivalry between the democratic, capitalist U.S. and the communist Soviet Union. This profound ideological divide literally split the globe in half. So while we technically avoided a direct Third World War, it was replaced by fierce arms races, proxy wars, and space exploration, all under the constant, lingering shadow of global nuclear annihilation. Yet, while projecting all this massive dominance abroad, America had to face its own deep societal fractures at home. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement was fighting tirelessly to dismantle a century of Jim Crow segregation, eventually securing landmark wins like the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So you have this incredible dynamic. The nation is fighting a profound moral battle for equality on its own streets, right at the exact same moment it's landing Apollo 11 on the moon in 1969 to prove its technological supremacy to the Soviets. When you step back and look at this entire explainer, the trajectory is stunning. We trace a path from a fragile 13-colony rebellion all the way to a 50-state global superpower, and it's a foundation built on amazing ideals of liberty, sweeping innovation, and migration, yes, but also on immense conflict, devastating campaigns of expansion, and immeasurable human costs. History is rarely a simple story of pure triumph. It's an incredibly complex puzzle. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. When we look back at the staggering human costs of all these macro-historical forces, from forced removals to global wars, we really have to ask ourselves, what patterns of empire, aggression, and internal fracture might we be blindly repeating today? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I encourage you to keep questioning the history that continues to shape our world.